Let me show you something that should make you nervous. Pull up a map of Latin America. Now mark every port, every highway, every dam, every mine where China has significant investment or ownership stake. The map bleeds red. Chinese companies own or operate major ports in Brazil, Peru, Chile, Panama, and Mexico. They've built highways in Ecuador, dams in Argentina, railways in Bolivia. They control critical mining operations across the continent. And the debt. The debt is everywhere. Venezuela owes China over $60 billion. Ecuador took $18 billion. Argentina, Brazil, Bolivia, Trinidad and Tobago, the list goes on. In 20 years, China went from a minor player to the largest bilateral lender in Latin America. Some call this development, investment, South-South cooperation. Others call it something darker, debt trap diplomacy, neo-colonialism with Chinese characteristics, the new scramble for Latin America. Who's right? The answer is more complicated than either side admits, but one thing is certain, something profound has shifted in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine is dead. China is here, and Latin America will never be the same. This is the story of how it happened, what it means, and what comes next. 1. The empty space. To understand China's rise in Latin America, you need to understand the vacuum it filled. For a century, Latin America was Washington's backyard, the Monroe Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Alliance for Progress, the Washington Consensus. American influence was so complete that it barely needed stating. Then the United States lost interest. After the Cold War ended, Latin America dropped down Washington's priority list. The Middle East, China's rise as a competitor, domestic politics, American attention went elsewhere. Aid declined, diplomacy atrophied, trade agreements stalled. The 2008 financial crisis made things worse. American banks that had lent to Latin America pulled back. IMF programs came with austerity conditions that were politically toxic. When Latin American countries needed capital, traditional sources said no or demanded painful reforms. Into this vacuum stepped China. Beijing had money, lots of it. Foreign exchange reserves exceeding $3 trillion. State-owned banks with no shareholders demanding quarterly returns. A government willing to play a long game. And China needed things Latin America had: soybeans, copper, iron ore, lithium, oil. The commodity boom of the 2000s was largely a China story. Chinese demand drove prices to historic highs. The logic was simple. Latin America had resources. China had cash and an appetite. Why wouldn't they do business? 2. The numbers. Let's look at the scale. Between 2005 and 2023, Chinese policy banks, primarily China Development Bank and China Export-Import Bank, lent over $140 billion to Latin American countries. That's more than the World Bank, Inter-American Development Bank, and CAF combined during the same period. The lending peaked in 2010 to 2015 when commodity prices were high and China was flush with cash. Venezuela alone took over $60 billion. Ecuador borrowed $18 billion. Brazil took $30 billion. Argentina, Bolivia, Jamaica, billions more. But loans are only part of the picture. Chinese foreign direct investment in Latin America exceeded $170 billion in the same period. Mining operations in Peru and Chile, agricultural land in Brazil, energy projects in Argentina, technology infrastructure everywhere. Chinese companies now control or have significant stakes in the port of Chancay in Peru, which will be the largest port on South America's Pacific coast. Major electricity transmission and generation assets in Brazil, Chile, and Peru. Lithium mining operations in Argentina and Chile, the heart of the lithium triangle. Telecommunications infrastructure in multiple countries, including 5G networks. The footprint is vast, and it happened so fast that many didn't notice until it was already done. 3. The Venezuela trap. If you want to understand Chinese lending at its most problematic, look at Venezuela. Hugo Chavez saw China as the perfect partner. Beijing didn't lecture him about democracy or human rights. They didn't demand IMF-style reforms, they just wanted oil. The arrangement seemed brilliant. China would lend Venezuela money. Venezuela would repay in oil shipments. Both sides got what they wanted. Between 2007 and 2015, Venezuela borrowed over $60 billion from China. The money funded social programs, infrastructure, and Chavez's political machine. Then oil prices crashed. The Venezuelan economy collapsed. The oil industry, already mismanaged, fell apart. Venezuela couldn't produce enough oil to service the debt. Shipments fell behind. The debt accumulated. What happened next is disputed. China's defenders say Beijing was flexible. They restructured loans, extended terms, reduced the required oil shipments. They didn't seize assets or demand regime change. Compared to what Western creditors did to Latin America in the 1982 debt crisis, China was lenient. China's critics say Beijing now owns Venezuela's future oil production. The restructured deals extended repayment for decades. Every barrel of oil Venezuela produces goes to China before Venezuelans see a centavo. The debt will constrain Venezuelan economic policy for generations. Both things are true. China didn't demand immediate repayment. China also ensured they'd be first in line for Venezuelan resources indefinitely. Is this a debt trap? Venezuela wasn't trapped by Chinese machinations. Venezuela was trapped by its own mismanagement and oil dependency. China just made sure they'd be repaid regardless. 4. The Ecuador model. Ecuador tells a different story. Under President Rafael Correa, Ecuador borrowed heavily from China, $18 billion between 2010 and 2017. The money funded highways, dams, and a modernized oil sector. Some of these projects were genuinely useful. The Coca-Codo-Sinclair Dam, though plagued by construction problems, provides significant hydroelectric power. But the terms were harsh. Chinese loans came at interest rates of 6 to 7%, far higher than World Bank rates of 1 to 2%. Repayment was often in oil, at prices locked in when oil was expensive. When oil prices fell, Ecuador was shipping the same barrels but getting less value. More troubling were the convenios de pago anticipado, advance payment agreements. Ecuador essentially pre-sold future oil production to China at discounted rates. The country mortgaged its resources for quick cash. When Correa left office, his successors discovered the true scale of Chinese obligations. The debt service was crushing. Ecuador had limited room to maneuver. In 2020, Ecuador restructured its debt with private bondholders but couldn't restructure the Chinese loans. Beijing held firm. The oil kept flowing east. Ecuador isn't a debt trap in the dramatic sense. China didn't seize an airport or a port, but Ecuador's economic sovereignty is meaningfully constrained by obligations to Beijing. Major policy decisions must account for Chinese repayment requirements. Is that colonialism? Maybe not in the 19th century sense, but it's certainly dependency. 5. The port strategy. Now, let's talk about what China actually wants, because it's not just loan repayment. Look at Chinese port investments across Latin America. In Peru, Chinese company COSCO built the port of Chancay. When operational, it will be the largest port on South America's Pacific coast, capable of receiving the biggest container ships in the world. Direct shipping to Shanghai will cut transit times dramatically. In Panama, Chinese companies operate ports on both ends of the Panama Canal. Hutchison Ports, based in Hong Kong, has operated there since the 1992. The strategic significance of the canal needs no explanation. In Brazil, Chinese companies have invested in ports at Santos, Paranagua, and São Luís. These ports export the soybeans and iron ore that feed Chinese industry. The pattern is clear. China is building a logistics network to extract Latin American resources and deliver Chinese goods. Ports are the choke points of global trade. Control the ports, and you shape the flow. Is this nefarious? American companies controlled Latin American ports for most of the 20th century. United Fruit Company essentially ran several Central American countries. Standard Oil dominated Venezuelan infrastructure. The playbook isn't new. But there's a difference. American dominance came with security guarantees, however self-interested. Chinese infrastructure investment comes with no such commitment. China is purely transactional. They want resources out and markets in. What happens to the countries in between is not their concern. 6. The lithium question. The future is electric, and the future runs on lithium. The lithium triangle, spanning Argentina, Bolivia, and Chile, contains over half of the world's known lithium reserves. This is the oil of the 21st century. Every electric vehicle battery, every grid storage system, every smartphone needs lithium. China understands this. Chinese companies have moved aggressively. In Argentina, Chinese companies control major stakes in lithium projects in the Salta and Jujuy provinces. Ganfeng Lithium, the world's largest lithium producer, has significant Argentine operations. In Chile, Chinese companies have invested in lithium processing and are negotiating for extraction rights. Chile has the highest quality lithium reserves in the world. Bolivia's lithium is less developed, but Chinese companies are positioned for when extraction begins. Simultaneously, China dominates lithium processing. Even lithium mined elsewhere often goes to China for refining into battery-grade material. They control the entire supply chain. The implications are serious. Latin America could repeat its historical pattern, exporting raw materials and importing finished goods. The value-added processing, the jobs and technology, would happen in China. Latin America would be left with holes in the ground and modest royalties. Or Latin American countries could demand more, require domestic processing, build their own battery industries, use the leverage of essential resources. So far, the results are mixed. Some countries are negotiating harder, others are taking Chinese investment on whatever terms are offered. The window to capture lithium value is now, and it's not clear Latin America will seize it. 7. The soft power play. Chinese influence isn't only economic. There's a cultural and diplomatic dimension too. Confucius Institutes have proliferated across Latin American universities. These Chinese government-funded cultural centers teach Mandarin and promote Chinese culture. Critics say they also suppress discussion of Taiwan, Tibet, and other sensitive topics. Chinese state media has expanded Latin American operations. CGTN, China's international news network, broadcasts throughout the region. Xinhua has partnerships with local news agencies. Scholarships bring Latin American students to Chinese universities. Government officials visit Beijing for training programs. Relationships are built that pay dividends for decades. And there's the diplomatic competition over Taiwan. 8 of Taiwan's remaining diplomatic allies are in Latin America and the Caribbean. These small countries recognize Taipei instead of Beijing, maintaining Taiwan's claim to international legitimacy. China has been picking them off, one by one. Panama switched to Beijing in 2017, El Salvador in 2018, Honduras in 2023. Each switch comes with promises of Chinese investment and aid. The remaining Taiwan allies, mostly small Caribbean nations, face increasing pressure. China offers infrastructure projects, debt relief, vaccine access. Taiwan can't match the resources. This isn't about altruism, it's about isolating Taiwan diplomatically, one small country at a time. Latin America and the Caribbean are the battlefield. 8. What China really wants. Let's be clear-eyed about Chinese motivations. China is not a charity. Chinese lending is not aid. Every investment is calculated for Chinese benefit. Resource security. China needs commodities it doesn't have. Soybeans for food, iron ore and copper for manufacturing, oil for energy, lithium for the future. Latin America has all of these. Securing supply chains is a strategic imperative. Market access. Latin America is 650 million consumers. Chinese manufacturers need markets. Infrastructure investments often come with requirements to use Chinese contractors, equipment, and materials. Geopolitical positioning. Latin America is America's backyard. Chinese presence here is leverage in the broader US-China competition. Every port and loan is a chip on the table. Diplomatic support. China wants allies, or at least non-enemies, in international forums. Latin American votes matter at the UN. Support on Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong is desired. None of this is hidden. Chinese officials are quite open about their interests. The Belt and Road Initiative has explicit goals of connecting Chinese industry to global markets and resources. The question isn't whether China acts in Chinese interests. Of course it does. The question is whether Latin American countries can navigate this relationship to their own benefit. 9. The American response, or lack thereof. Where is the United States in all this? Mostly absent. American investment in Latin America has been flat or declining for 2 decades. U.S. development finance was underfunded and scattered across agencies. Trade agreements stalled in Congress. The Trump administration talked tough about Chinese influence but offered no alternative. The America First approach meant less engagement, not more. The Biden administration launched the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity, but it's modest compared to Chinese scale. Billions versus tens of billions. Bureaucratic processes versus Chinese speed. The fundamental problem is that the US doesn't have a compelling offer. China offers infrastructure loans with minimal conditions. The US offers lectures about governance and environmental standards. China builds things quickly, even if quality is sometimes poor. US projects take years to approve and implement. China deals with whoever is in power. the US ties aid to democratic norms that unpopular leaders would rather ignore. For a Latin American president who needs a highway before the next election, China is the obvious choice. The American alternative is a seminar on best practices. This isn't a defense of Chinese practices. Many Chinese loans have been problematic, projects have failed, terms have been exploitative, environmental and labor standards have been poor. But at least China shows up. American neglect enabled Chinese expansion. The vacuum was created before China filled it. 10. Is it colonialism? Let's address the question directly. Is China the new colonizer? The comparison is tempting but imprecise. European colonialism involved direct political control. Extraction of resources was backed by military force. Local populations were enslaved, displaced, or killed. Sovereignty was erased. Chinese engagement is different. China doesn't seek political control. They don't send armies or install governors. They work with existing governments, regardless of ideology. But economic dependency can be its own form of control. When a country can't make major decisions without considering Chinese debt obligations, that's constrained sovereignty. When critical infrastructure is Chinese-owned, that's leverage. When resource exports are locked into Chinese supply chains, that's dependency. The colonial powers didn't need to control everything directly either. Informal empire, sphere of influence, economic dependency, these terms describe relationships short of colonialism but still deeply unequal. Perhaps we need new language. Not colonialism, which carries specific historical meaning, but not partnership either, which implies equality that doesn't exist. Maybe asymmetric engagement, or neo-dependency, or just the new normal. Whatever we call it, Latin America is more tied to China than at any point in history. Whether that's opportunity or trap depends on choices that Latin American governments are making right now. 11. The choices ahead. The story isn't over. Latin America has agency. Outcomes aren't predetermined. Some countries are navigating Chinese engagement skillfully. Chile maintains economic ties with China while preserving political independence. They've signed trade agreements but limited infrastructure dependency. They're demanding better terms for lithium. Mexico has been cautious about Chinese investment, partly due to US pressure, partly due to their own strategic calculation. Nearshoring is bringing manufacturing that might otherwise go to China. Others are more vulnerable. Venezuela has no leverage. Their Chinese dependency will constrain policy for decades regardless of who governs. Ecuador's room to maneuver is limited by existing obligations. Smaller Caribbean nations, desperate for any investment, accept terms they may later regret. The patterns of the next decade will be set by negotiations happening now. Lithium contracts, port concessions, debt restructurings, each deal shapes the future relationship. Latin America could use Chinese interest as leverage for better terms from all partners. Play Beijing against Washington. Extract technology transfer requirements. Demand domestic processing. Or Latin America could repeat historical patterns. Export raw materials. Import finished goods. Accumulate debt that constrains future choices. Watch wealth flow out while poverty persists. The resources are there. The question is, who captures the value? Conclusion. The new map. A century ago, European and American companies controlled Latin American resources. They extracted wealth that built New York and London while Latin American countries stayed poor. That era ended, mostly. Latin American countries nationalized resources, built domestic industries, and gained real sovereignty. Now a new map is being drawn. Chinese companies control ports, mines, and energy assets across the continent. Chinese banks hold debt that constrains government choices. Chinese demand shapes what gets produced and where it goes. Is this better or worse than the old arrangement? Different, certainly. China's approach has advantages. Less political interference, more pragmatic engagement, genuine infrastructure investment. But the fundamental dynamic rhymes with history. A major power needs Latin American resources. That power has capital Latin America lacks. Deals are struck that may or may not benefit local populations. The difference is Latin America knows this history. They've seen this movie before. The question is whether they'll write a different ending. China isn't going away. American absence created opportunity that Beijing seized. The relationship will deepen before it stabilizes. What Latin America does with this moment, whether they negotiate better terms, build domestic capacity, diversify partners, or simply accept dependency, will shape the region for generations. The new colonizer? Perhaps not. but certainly a new power with old patterns. The chains look different now. They're made of loans and contracts instead of warships and soldiers. But chains nonetheless, if Latin America doesn't find a way to hold the other end. If this analysis helped you see the bigger picture, hit that subscribe button. Because the story of China in Latin America is just beginning, and the chapters being written now will matter for decades. See you in the comments. And remember, economics is just power wearing a suit, and right now, there's a new power at the table.